Hi, I'm Wacey Lim, and I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about dual coding theory. So, breaking it down, just breaking down those words. Dual, as most of us probably know, means consisting of two parts, elements, or aspects. Coding is the process of assigning a code to something for the purposes of classification or identification. So what I tried to do was kind of make my own definition from just breaking down breaking down those words. And here's what I came up with for dual coding theory: is basically a theory containing two different elements to classify information. So that was the definition that I had kind of came up with before I had even looked at the real definition. And I looked at the real definition, and it was a theory of cognition according to which humans process and represent verbal and nonverbal information in separate related systems. So I would say my definition was pretty close. We have two different kind of elements, verbal and nonverbal, and that's going to help us be able to store and remember information. So just a little bit of background on this theory. It was developed by Alan Pavio in 1971. This theory suggests that there are two distinct subsystems contributing to cognition. So there's the language and the verbal information, which would be words, sentences, different things like that. And then the other one is images and nonverbal information. So that's going to be, like it says, images or drawings, videos, anything to try to connect the dots that isn't actual language. So according to Pavio, human cognition is unique in that it has become specialized for dealing simultaneously with language and with nonverbal objects and events. So basically, Pavio has this theory and idea that we work most effectively when we can simultaneously use language and nonverbal objects to help us create these schema to try to remember things later on down the road. So here's kind of a visual representation of what dual coding theory looks like. So as you see here, you're going to start with one of two different stimuli. We can start with words, or we can start with some kind of a picture. Okay, those are going to use two different senses. So if we're listening to words, we're obviously going to be using our ears. We're looking at different pictures, different diagrams. We're going to be using our eyes. And then this is where I kind of like the diagram. It starts talking about working memory, and it says limited capacity. So if we're only learning about something using our verbal processing through words, we're probably going to be able to remember that to a certain degree, but in a limited capacity. And same with a picture. If we're only looking at pictures or diagrams and nonverbal processing, then we're only going to be able to remember those in a limited capacity. However, I like this line here. It says connections and integrations. So basically, when we can connect these two things, kind of put them together, that's going to get us to this long-term memory where we're going to have knowledge over a long period of time. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, or in a depiction, what dual coding theory looks like. So quick, I want to go through some researchers for dual coding theory, their relevant works. So obviously, Alan Pavio, who developed dual coding theory in 1971, he was a psychology professor at the University of Western Ontario, and he gives kind of a classic example of this theory, and he uses dogs to do it. So basically, we can say that a person has stored or made this stimulus concept of a dog, right? When we think of a dog, you'll probably think of one of two different things. You're either going to think of how to spell dog, or you're going to think of a picture of a dog. So those are the two different stimuli that we can kind of create around this concept of a dog. And that's what Pavio is saying, is that when we're trying to recall a certain concept, like dog, you're either going to recall the word or the image. And bottom line, Pavio is saying that the ability to code a stimulus, like dog, in two different ways is going to increase the chance of remembering that item compared to if the stimulus was only coded one way. So if we can um, both look at these concepts with the verbal and nonverbal aspects, that's going to help us to remember these things later on down the road. So that's Alan Pavio. The next two I kind of grouped into one. That's John Anderson and Gordon Bower. So together they developed a theory in 1973 that was based on dual coding theory. And what they're trying to say basically is that visual information can often be enhanced when paired with relative verbal information. And how's that relevant today? Well, exactly what I'm doing right now and what many of our teachers have done in the past, or if you've given other presentations, is that you're basically using this multimedia presentation. And in these multimedia presentations, we're giving both verbal and nonverbal cues to the audience to try and get them to build these stimuli to create a stronger memory of that. So if we can portray our message with both verbal and nonverbal cues, that's going to help our audience. And that's basically what Anderson and Bower were presenting. My last researcher that I want to quickly talk about, his name is Robert Sternberg. In 2012, he published a book titled Cognitive Psychology. In this book, he outlined several different theories of human cognition, and he focused on two of them, or his main focus was on two of them. The first one was visual perception, and the second one was language. So he discussed how, when these two areas are used together, memory processes are stronger and humans are able to retrieve information for longer periods of time. So you can see how this directly relates to Pavio's theory because it's taking the verbal and the nonverbal aspects, combining them together to basically give us longer memory of these stimuli. All right, so real quick, I'm just going to play this short little video about how or what dual coding theory is and how this particular teacher has used it with her students in her classroom. All right, so just a quick look at how that teacher used it specifically in her class. I'm going to give you a little bit of my own example. For those of you who don't know, I'm a high school science teacher, and here in just a couple weeks we're actually going to get into ecology. And so I've come up with my own example of both verbal and nonverbal that I'll actually use with my students. So I'll start with the verbal method using language and words. So just a little terminology for ecology. We start off with an individual, which is any living thing or organism. Then you kind of move up the scale to population. That's a group of individuals of a given species in a particular area at the same time. A community is all the population of different species in a particular area at the same time. An ecosystem, that includes both living organism and non-living organisms in a particular area at the same time. So that's all of your living organisms from the community, but an ecosystem is going to add the non-living things like water, rocks, air, different things like that. A biome is going to be a set of ecosystems sharing similar characteristics with their abiotic factors adapted to their environments. And last, the biosphere is the sum of all the ecosystems established on planet Earth. It is the living component of the Earth system. Okay, so that right there is the verbal method. It's awfully wordy. Students will have a hard time remembering everything just because the amount of words, but there are a couple things that they will be able to take away. The next method is the nonverbal method. So this is actually using images, videos, drawings, different things like that to help solidify this idea. So here's what this nonverbal method could look like. So students will be able to see what a single individual looks like. Okay, in this particular instance, it's an elk. Then we kind of move up our scale to a population. Okay, now there's multiple elk in the same area at the same time. Okay, continue moving on. We have our community. That's all of the living organisms in one area at the same time. Then we have our ecosystem. This is where you're starting to add in the non-living things like water, air, rocks, things like that. Biome, and then the last thing, biosphere, the entire life on Earth, essentially. So that's the non-verbal method compared to the verbal method. And which method is more important? I ask myself this, I ask my students this, and after researching a little bit on what Pavio has to say about it, he says that neither is more important than the other. However, he described that when both methods can be used simultaneously, learning will increase because students can access the information within different channels of their brains, either verbal or nonverbal. So it's not saying one is necessarily more effective than another or more important than another, but using both together can be extremely important and beneficial to our students. So in a nutshell, here is dual coding theory. We have basically, here's our brain. We have two different roadways in which we can learn. We have verbal and we have visual. So in order for us to basically create these schema or these ideas and remember things for a long extended period of time, Pavio is telling us that we need to use both visual cues with verbal cues in order to create these really strong ideas that we will be able to remember for an extended period of time. So in a nutshell, that is dual coding theory. Thanks.